stands out among an extremely competitive selective honors program where we have many students who are very driven and smart and accomplished, but this student is, again, among the top 10, top 5%. That's a really good way for recommenders to provide that kind of context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, that should help inform you to think, okay, if I'm going to invite or approach a faculty member to write a letter for me, I should be sure that I did very well in that class. It wasn't just that I had perfect attendance and then, I did well enough. If I knew I was, the top 2 or 3 scorers in that particular class, that might be a good criteria for you to select.
It's also the case that if a student is applying for something that requires demonstrating leadership skills or working with other people, it really helps if I've actually seen that student doing those things in my class or had advised that student in such a capacity. If I am looking at the same resume that another person is, and that's all I have to go on, I'm not going to be able to give a very vivid portrait or a convincing account of those qualities that the student needs to demonstrate.
Very good point. So we're kind of dancing around the question of, whom should I ask, right? And I think first and foremost, it should be someone who knows you very well. And very well, of course, is subjective. What does that mean? If you took a large lecture class with a tenured professor, you're one of 300 students in that class, your recitations or breakout sessions were taught by a TA, and you never really talked to them face to face, that would not be a good choice, right? And that does not mean you cannot help that faculty member get to know you better. There are opportunities for engagement through office hours, through extra credit assignments, through just simply asking questions or asking about research opportunities. Smaller classes are often good for this. I think one of the great advantages of Barrett is that everyone starts with a small class and they get to know 1 or 2 faculty members very well. So think, do they know you? And if they don't know you and you know that you'd like to approach them for a letter at some point, think about how could you cultivate that relationship without also stalking them, right? And they should be relevant to the context. So different fellowships prioritize different things. If you're applying to the Goldwater Scholarship, for instance, which is exclusively for people that want to eventually pursue PhDs in STEM fields, a letter from your English 101 teacher is not going to be relevant, no matter how good it is, right? A letter from your history professor or the supervisor in your residence hall position, not relevant. Because it's specifically for STEM, and so they want to hear from STEM faculty. And so that's one thing that you should talk with us about. Of who do they want? Who do these readers want to hear from? Who do they consider to be credible in terms of the context? And as Dr. Bhattacharya was just saying, if it's a fellowship that prioritizes, say, leadership, have you demonstrated leadership in that person's presence? There's scholarships that I work with that specifically ask letter writers to write on things in the application. So if the student wrote about an example, that letter needs to talk about that example that was provided. So it's important to think about, what is it they can actually talk about? And maybe they can talk mostly about one thing, but not another. That could be fine, right? They can just stick to what they know. So other advice that we have for students as they're thinking about, okay, who could I approach for this? Where should I start?
I think students who are taking a lot of online classes sometimes have trouble identifying who might be a good reference. Obviously, if you're doing well in a class, that is a good person to reach out to. But as Dr. Marks was saying, just because you have an online relationship with the professor doesn't mean that you are necessarily somebody that you have to rule out your online professor. You can actually do all these things like ask questions and show up for office hours and still sort of establish that connection where that person be able to write about you.
Excellent suggestion. And thank you for bringing that up, because I wanted to be sure we address that, because we are seeing increased numbers of students who are exclusively online or digital immersion students coming through our offices applying for fellowships. This past cycle, we, for the first time ever, nominated a student for the Marshall Scholarship, which is one of the most prestigious scholarships that we work with a 3% selection rate. And she was a competitive applicant because she had worked very hard to cultivate these relationships. Absolutely.
I just put a resource in the chat for those of you who are a little intimidated about going to see your professors during office hours. First of all, you shouldn't feel that way because that's why they pay us the big bucks, right? Is to be available to you. We want to talk to you. We want to hear from you, even when you're not in our classes anymore. We love catching up with students and knowing what they're doing. And the best way to do that is to come to our office hours. And so sometimes students find that a little bit daunting. They think it's scary, but it's not. And ASU actually has produced some resources to help you overcome that fear. And again, it's especially important for online students who don't get other opportunities to interact with faculty. Office hours are a great way to do that.
I just want to add, sometimes it is a common thought to ask somebody who you may know peripherally, who has some kind of name or title recognition in the particular field that you're in, or that the fellowship is relevant to. And by and large, although sometimes there's specifications they give who it must come from, and you always want to follow that, but by and large, going with the option that knows you better is much more important. Oh, so yes, much more important than going with somebody who whose name or title is going to be recognized easily by the folks who are reading your application and letters.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot we had one more bullet point on here, but Shay is exactly right. One of the things that you should work with us to because we know the audience and the programs very well. You know, who would this audience consider to be credible? And sometimes it has to do with title, sometimes it doesn't, right? Sometimes it has to do with station or profession or something like that. And so we'd want to be sure that they see it as credible. But we'll talk a bit more about credibility coming up. For me, you know, I always encourage faculty members to use a lot of concrete detail and examples, right? It's very easy to just toss about these abstract terms and hyperbole about how amazing and thoughtful and hardworking and how much poise they have, which is a word that I ban in letters of recommendation. But you know, that they can actually point to specific examples or things that you did in their presence or that they're aware of. That makes a letter come to life. And I think the best letters are really written with enthusiasm. I can tell the letters that were written in haste or perhaps copied and pasted from other places. You know, that they don't want to do any harm, but they also maybe didn't take the time to make a custom letter for you. So, I mean, do know that I think I worry sometimes that undergraduates think that letters of recommendation is like a checkbox in the application. Like you just need to get it done, and that's good enough. These things are very competitive, right? And so we'd like to see letters that are written with enthusiasm, there's obvious investment from them that they want to see you do well. And it's especially helpful if they can talk about the context of the fellowship themselves. So I encourage faculty members to actually mention the fellowship, talk about why they think they would be good for it on the basis of what they know. And to that end, for many of the awards with which we work, we also provide what's called a memorandum of guidance for your letter writers. And this is a PDF that you can take and give or forward to the people whom you invite. And it actually explains the context of the fellowship, you know, gives them information about timeline and provides some advice for like what works best in this particular situation. So yeah, any other thoughts on what makes for a very strong letter of recommendation?
I think that point about speaking to the specific context of the fellowship is extremely important. One thing that I always do for students when they ask me for letters is to provide me with the specifics of the opportunity that they're applying, a website, a description of the program, and then I ask the student to create a bullet point of skills and abilities and experiences that they have that they think are directly applicable to that experience. So it's not helpful for the student to tell me, I'm very hardworking and I am very dedicated and I am very committed to this and I have a passion for this particular thing. It's much more useful for me to know that the student has done certain things or developed certain skills that are directly applicable to the opportunity that they're applying for. And so you can provide that to your recommender. In fact, it's very helpful for them.
I had intended to make a slide that summarized this, and you just reminded me that I forgot to. But I advise students, particularly for very complicated scholarships or if they're applying for multiple scholarships, to make a packet, which is today, in these days, is virtual. So maybe a Dropbox folder or a Google folder. But it should have in there, you want to provide them, once you've gotten a soft agreement, like, yeah, I think I could do that for you. A copy of your resume. If you wrote anything for them, include papers that you've previously written or that they've graded, or any assignments that you did for them so they can refresh on that. They don't have to look through an old grade book. Of course, all the resources that we're talking about, make sure that they have access to the fellowship and the criteria. Many scholarships even have a page on their website specifically for faculty members and letters of recommendation, which is very helpful. And I do think that guidance as well. When students approach me for letters of recommendation, I usually ask them, well, what are you applying for and why are you applying for it? Tell me why you want this. How does this fit in to your career plans? Why is this a good idea? And that works as well for graduate school and everything else. And that's where I find that helpful, because then I can support that argument that the student's making. So you'll often encounter a distinction between academic and non-academic references, and a lot of students are confused as what that means. So an academic reference is anyone who's taught you or supervised your research, right? So they taught you in a credit or even non-credit bearing, but they're a university faculty member or staff member who's taught you or supervised your research. They can speak to your ability to perform in an academic context. As we've been indicating, some scholarships may prefer a higher rank or a tenure track rank. We will signal to you very clearly when that is. Something like the Goldwater Scholarship, for instance, they're going to want to see a tenured track faculty member, which means assistant, associate, or full professor. Something is very competitive, like the Rhodes or Marshall, like they would want to see that kind of title. In most cases, the title does not matter so much as whether or not they're credible. That being said, we usually steer people away from getting graduate students who might be your TA or your research supervisor or postdocs, because these people haven't written a lot of letters, right? They'll gain experience soon enough, but you might be the first or third student they've ever written a letter for. That might not be their strong suit just yet, and they haven't worked with a lot of students, right? Because we talked before about putting you in context. If they say this is the best student I've ever supervised and you're the second student they've ever supervised, then that's actually not that impressive yet. So something to think about again. And in this particular case, what I know I've advised students to do, particularly if they're involved in a STEM research lab or some kind of research group or something like that, is do work primarily with your grad student supervisor or your postdoc supervisor to draft a good solid base letter, and then work with the faculty member who is the PI or whoever's in charge of the group that you're in to actually be the signatory. And this is actually quite commonly done, because that whoever, a tenured professor who's leading a research group or center or lab, they are the face of it. They're the head of state for that particular group, and they're usually quite happy to do that because they want to see their students do well. They just maybe haven't worked with you face to face. So any thoughts or anything I didn't mention about academic references?
Well, I think for some students, it may be hard to navigate the hierarchies of academia and to understand what different titles mean. So as Dr. Mox mentioned, if they are specifying that they want a tenure track or tenured professor, that person will only have the title of assistant professor, associate professor, or just professor. Any other titles most likely are non-tenure eligible faculty. So that's one way for you to be able to parse through the nuances of academic hierarchies.
It is complicated, and especially at a place like ASU. There are a lot of different types of titles. And again, that's something that we'll flag for you. I mean, there is the Yenching Academy Scholarship, for instance, actually specifies associate professor or professor. Like they won't actually accept a letter of recommendation from any other type of faculty member. And then that's just a peculiarity of that particular award, which is sponsored by a Chinese university, right? In most other cases like Fulbright, they have no specifications whatsoever. They just want to hear from somebody who cares enough to write a strong letter. So always ask us if you're not sure about things. Things get a little less clear when we talk about non-academic references, and so I say somebody with some professional standing, that they have a profession, they have a job. This isn't, a family friend or something like that. And they've worked with you in a supervisory role, not as an equal, not as a peer, but as somebody who is in charge of your evaluation, somebody who could hire and fire you, even if you're a volunteer. So internship supervisors, obviously employers, any volunteer position you've been in, faculty advisors for clubs or organizations, all could qualify. So even if they hadn't seen you in an academic context, these could qualify if they're allowed. And they're going to be more or less feasible in some cases over others, right? The Marshall Scholarship, for instance, actually designates letters as preferred, meaning whoever's going to write you the strongest letter, general, which is an academic reference, and then leadership, which can or cannot be, and so you've got to think through that. The Rhodes Scholarship asks for 4 academic letters of reference, and then 1 to 5 additional letters that can be non-academic. So there is some strategy involved here, and so I think it's really important to talk to us about, whom you're going to approach, right?
Can I just add something there?
Mm-hmm.
I think because there are sometimes, so again, some awards will want to see, in addition to academic references, non-academic ones, right? But sometimes your non-academic reference, somebody to speak to your leadership skills, your professional skills, they themselves be in the academic profession, right? They may be a professor, but you want them to speak to your role as maybe they advised you in a club where you were the president, or they supervised you in a lab, but you want them to speak to that more as the leadership and professional skills you have, and not as focused on the academic side of that lab experience. You want to make sure that those individuals know that when you ask them that this is the side of you that you're asking them to speak to, if that's the case. It doesn't necessarily happen often that there's that overlap, but if you are asking somebody like that, make sure they're aware.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we'll talk. We're getting into the part now. We'll actually talk about like how to ask, which is really as important as whom to ask. In terms of missteps that I've seen from people, generally speaking, do not ask a high school teacher. Exceptions to this would be if you're applying for an award that takes applications from a first-year student or even maybe a second-year student in some cases. But I've had students try to get letters from high school students when they're a senior applying for graduate awards. The distance is too far away. The context is so different, and the high school teacher can't compare you to other high achieving college seniors, only to what they remember of you as a high school senior. The other exception, then the asterisk here, is like, well, maybe the interaction's been recent. So I've had good letters from graduating college seniors who have returned to the classroom to help. They went back and helped teach an AP bio class from time to time, or they stayed involved with them from extracurricular activity, or that relationship was extraordinary in some way. So letters can expire, their shelf date can expire, right? Don't ask somebody your age, right? Don't ask another person that was in the club. Don't ask the president of your student organization for a letter, kind of for the same reasons of why we don't ask grad students, is they haven't written anything like this before. They don't have a frame of reference. And, from the reader's point of view, they don't have a lot of credibility, unfortunately. So that's a question I get a lot, and this goes without saying, but, don't write it yourself. And this is something we encounter quite a bit. And what will happen is faculty members who might be very busy, or boss who might be very busy, say, great, well, why don't you go ahead and write one up for yourself and I'll take a look at it and sign it. This is problematic, right? Because, if somebody's signing at the bottom of a letter, they are basically saying, these are my words and I wrote this, right? So it's a form of plagiarism, actuality. How do we navigate this? Ansa Folk, how have you worked with students when this pops up? Because it pops up quite often.
When that happens, I always ask the student to either go back to the recommender and explain to them the ethical issues with that, and then ask if they would have time to do it, and then not to waste any more time. If that person is at all reluctant, find someone else. And of course, we can help you identify other folks who would be better recommenders, but sometimes you just have to cut your losses and move on. And I would say the same thing with anyone who seems less than enthusiastic about writing for you. If they're like, well, I don't know, maybe, probably not the best person to write for you, and we should identify someone else.
Another thing, oh,
No, go ahead.
sorry, if you haven't already, which has been indicated that it's a good idea for you to do this by both Dr. Marks and Dr. Stoff already, but if you haven't already done this, if you get that kind of, you write the letter and I'll sign off on it response, is here's, some of the application materials I'm working on, here's my resume to help you in writing this letter, because that is what's required here. If this is helpful, or I can provide any other, information or documents or insight to you, I'd be happy to. Is this something that you feel you can do, right? Or you're willing to do or able, whatnot. So that can be a good follow-up, or kind of, if you've already shared that stuff with them, bringing it back into the, so I shared this, Dropbox folder with you that it has all of these documents and whatnot available as you write this letter. Is that helpful, or is there something else that you're looking for?
Yeah, very good advice. I would encourage you to distinguish too, because sometimes students have relayed to me like, oh, they wanted me to just write the letter myself. And I've talked to the faculty members, and what they said was like, well, no, what I asked for them is to write bullet points, kind of what Dr. Stoff was saying. I wanted them to draft the skeleton of this, and then I will write the letter, because I would like for them to determine what I should emphasize. And that's a very different thing than, will you just write the letter? And I'll be frank, I've read letters that people have written for themselves and they're not good, right? You don't have any experience writing a letter of recommendation for, to this audience. You can't put yourself in comparison with the other students, and it's kind of awkward to do so. And so they're usually just full of a lot of abstractions and hyperbole, and read an awful lot like they were written by ChatGPT. So even disregarding the ethical issues with it, it's also not effective for the most part. So to review, we want to think about credibility, right? Thinking about the audience, who do they want to hear from? Do they specify who they want to hear from? Are there any requirements? Talking to us based on our understanding, what do these selection committees look for in letters? Does it matter? Even if somebody does have a lot of credibility, can they share information that's relevant to the context? Can they share information that speaks to the criteria for this award? And is this a recent letter, right? We get more than 2 or 3 or 4 years out, things start to get stale, and people wonder, what, has this person not done anything amazing in the last 4 years? But yeah, we start to see this all the time. We were just talking about, the ghost of students past who appear 4 or 5 years down the road to ask for a med school letter. How do we react to that? How do you deal with it when a student appears after a long absence?
Well, since I'm currently doing this for several students, the first thing I always ask is for them to send me all of the materials that Dr. Marks mentioned before, a current resume or CV, transcript, a description of the program that they're applying for. And then I usually ask them to come and see me, and we can have a chat so that we can catch up. And my first question is, why? Why do you want to apply for this? What is your motivation? How does this fit with your long-term goals? Tell me what you've been doing between the time that you were in my class 3 years ago and now, that are moving you towards that goal, that will help me to build a case for why this is your necessary next step.
I do all the things that Dr. Stoff said, but I'll admit, entire time I'm wondering, how is it that the student hasn't been able to find anybody else within the last 4 or 5 years? Because they really should be trying to cultivate references the whole time, who are witnessing you developing new skills and new areas. So try to not be lazy about just having the same 3 references for 4 years. Be conscious of how you're developing and who could actually speak to those aspects when you're looking for a reference.
Yeah, I in the past year, I had somebody who took a 1 credit hour class with me 2 or 3 years ago, asked for a letter for medical school. And my response on in that case wasn't necessarily because it was stale at that point, but I just didn't feel that I could provide useful information to a medical school admissions committee based on our 1 hour a week of interaction several years ago. And I worked with a student to brainstorm ideas about who might be a better choice, and the truth is, good letters of recommendation take a long time to write. It's not an easy thing to do, particularly if you really want to do well for the student. I was just writing university nomination letters for an award this past week, and I probably spent 20 to 25 hours on it over a period of 10 days, 7 days. I don't know. It was a blur, but because it does take time to really craft a good persuasive letter. So I call it making the ask. This is actually a pretty important skill to develop. You want to give them plenty of time, and this is known, right? That I say 4 to 6 weeks is kind of the sweet spot. I actually advise kind of a 2-step process, meaning you want to probe and see if there is, in general interest or agreement to this, and then you'll follow up with those materials. I think it'd be a little intimidating if the first email I got from a student is 6 attachments and this long list of criteria and a deadline. And I'll be, that kind of sours me. I'm like, more work. If it's a nice, gentle email about, hey, is this something you'd be interested in? Then I'm a little more open to agreeing to that. I think it's useful to find some time to actually say, hey, could we get together? When are your office hours this semester? Would you like to grab a coffee or something like that? Just make it clear that this isn't a transactional thing. Even in this age of Zoom, and more than likely the faculty member will say, yeah, we can just meet via Zoom, that's fine. But make that offer to say, oh, I'd love to pass by for office hours, or hey, could we meet the Burning Bee for some coffee, or something like that. And it makes it more personal, because this is, you're asking faculty members particularly for their most important resource, which is time. And of course, be polite and professional in all correspondence, making sure that you're using titles, whether that's professor or doctor or dean or whatever else. Even if you feel like you know them on a first name basis, I would err on the side of formality, because there are many people who get diminished or marginalized through titles, and those that don't, and that no one's ever going to be angry at you for calling them by their professional title. If they tell you to call them by their first name, please do. I find it slightly offensive when students are very quick and breezy, as if they just wrote this as it was a text message. That previews for me what this relationship is going to be like from here on out. And I get a little shaky about it, but yeah, on to folks. Any other tips for kind of nuts and bolts? And next slide or two, we'll talk about like actually how to word this request, but in terms of timing or thinking about context or anything like that.
I do have a suggestion about timing, because it is kind of an art. You definitely want to ask well in advance of the opportunity to give the faculty member enough time to craft a really strong letter. At the same time, if you ask too far in advance, I guarantee you that will go down to the bottom of the faculty member's inbox and they may not remember.
Right.
So there's a sweet spot, right? 4 to 6 weeks is really where you want to try to hit. And if you feel like you have to ask at a time before that, well in advance of that, that's okay. But you should send friendly reminders about 4 to 6 weeks before the due date for the particular opportunity, with all of the materials again, even though you've already done it, just because there are many other things that faculty member may have on their plate, and they may not, because it gets pushed to the bottom, they may not remember. So gentle, friendly, professional reminders with all of the materials again, if you feel like you have to ask well before that 4 to 6 week period. But definitely don't ask the week before. I would beg of you, do not do that. That is a terrible practice.
Yeah.
So that takes some vigilance on your part, right? To make sure that you know when the deadlines for things are coming up.
Definitely
The
want
only
to amplify that. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead, Shane.
The only thing I would say is there are some times where it's going to be due like during or immediately following when people are on break. And so if the 4 to 6 week timeline puts you in when like maybe that professor is on winter break or summer break, it might be a good idea in those circumstances to make the ask earlier. But then again, like Dr. Stoff said, giving that reminder as you get closer. Because yeah, if you send the request right at the start of winter break or right at the start of summer break, some folks might not be as closely watching their messages. So.
And I would really like to emphasize the reminders. I tell students who ask me for letters to remind me every week, every 2 weeks or something. I'm not offended. I promise you, you have no idea how many emails I get. Because I did have a student. I failed to write a letter for a student. She asked me for a letter at the start of the term, which, you know, there's nothing going on at the start of the term, right? And then never said another word. And then the deadline came and went. And she was very upset that I hadn't sent the letter. As it turns out, I wasn't the only one of her references that didn't send a letter because she didn't go around and remind anyone. I would really encourage that practice. In terms of how you approach, like what I would suggest is avoid saying, could you write me a letter of recommendation, right? Because faculty members are by and large helper people, and they don't like saying no to things. That's a boundary issue that many faculty members have. But, you know, if you say, do you think you could write me a letter of recommendation? They would be like, yeah, I could, you know, or yes, or they're not going to say, no, I can't write you one. You know, that's not a specific enough question. And I think even if you get a yes, you want to be sure you have an enthusiastic yes right here. So a better way to ask is, do you feel that you know me, my leadership, my academic record, my whatever it is that you want them to talk about well enough to compose a strong letter of support for my blank application? And that way you've given them the assignment so they know that I don't have to cover everything about you. They just want me to write about them as a scholar, great, or them as a researcher, or them as a volunteer, wonderful. For this specific context, like, yeah, actually, I know a lot about that. I could do that. Yeah, I feel like I can totally do this. And they know the terms of it better. And that way you give them the opportunity to actually say, you know, I don't think I know you well enough, or I don't think I would actually be of benefit here to this context. And that's a good no, right? Because you don't want a yes and then have somebody write a letter that's not credible, relevant to the audience, right? So give them a chance to say no, because otherwise it may not help you at all anyway. So as we've already said, you know, communicate early and often, checking in every now and then, giving friendly reminders, brief professional reminders, share those materials, as we mentioned. I think it's also good, and I recommend this to applicants, now get them on board as you're sharing drafts of your personal statement or other statements that you have to write for the application. Say, oh, I just want to give you, I know we're about 3 weeks out, just wanted to give you a draft of my personal statement. Curious if you had any suggestions, right? And then they actually get invested in this process. They already agreed that they want you to do well, but now they also have a dog in the hunt. And they want to see you succeed. As everyone on the panel said, you know, do everything you can to be helpful. Make it as easy as possible for them to find the materials, to find the deadlines, to understand how to submit. We actually have a unique email address in our office specific for faculty members to send letters of recommendation. It makes things very simple for them. But, you know, share all that information with them. And we haven't talked about this at all yet, but show gratitude. One of the most common comments I get from faculty members is they'll email and say, hey, whatever happened to so-and-so? Did they get the award? What sorts of acts of gratitude have we seen or do we recommend for students, you know, to help manage these good relationships?
A check made out directly to me, deposited. No, just kidding. I love to hear what the progress that students make. It's always wonderful to know that something that you were a part of was a success. So let the faculty member know what, and even if you're not successful, I still love to know, and then be encouraging of the student to apply for other things, to say, hey, don't take it personally. These are competitive awards. Let me know if there's something in the future that I can help you with, if you need other letters. So it's really in your best interest to keep that relationship going. And the best way to do that is to just keep the faculty member in the loop about your progress.
I think it'd be great to show some gratitude once it has been completed, but before you even know what the turnout is as well, reach out to them, send them a handwritten card. Oh my gosh, how often does that happen anymore these days? But it could just be an email as well. So just showing that gratitude before you even know the outcome can go a long way. In maintaining that strong rapport you have with that individual.
Absolutely. Handwritten thank you note. I love thank you notes. Like, they make my day. And if you've ever seen or been in my office, I've got like 2 shelves that's just full of different thank you notes that students have shared. And I like small little gifts too. A Starbucks card's fine, but I actually can't use it at the Starbucks in our building. So, and I know $5 is a lot for students, and that's cool too. But I've got little trinkets and little things all over in my office that I'm very proud of, because that student valued that relationship enough and wanted to, signify their gratitude. So it's recognized, it's appreciated, even if they don't seem like they're that excited about it. No, everyone appreciates a show of gratitude.
Whenever I've written for a student who has gotten something that allows them to travel abroad, I'm always delighted when they send a postcard from that place.
Yeah. I've got a bunch of those. I love that. So, if you haven't been to our website, do know that there's a scholarships area that has a database. You can search through different awards and then start to figure out, okay, how many letters do I need for these different things? If you're ready to talk to us about any specific awards, you can make appointments through our website, of course. And if you're not already subscribed to the weekly bulletin, I really urge you to do that. That way, you know what deadlines are coming up, and you can be thoughtful and telling faculty members that, hey, we're 6 weeks out from this. We hate it when we hear, oh, I didn't know. I just found out about this, right? Because these things do take times. Speaking of time, just know that if you're thinking about some of the big awards like Marshall and Rhodes, we have very early deadlines because these are very labor intensive. So April 15 is our first deadline for current students to submit their intent to apply for the Rhodes or Marshall scholarship. And if you're thinking about Fulbright, which is one of our other major postgraduate awards, we're going to get started towards the end of March. So we have a big event called Fulbright Day at ASU. And then we're going to be launching into workshop series, and the application opens April 1. And from that point forward, we're advising and working with students. And so we would actually advise, at least I do, that students get that verbal agreement from folks at the end of the term, because as Shay pointed out, once we go into summer break, a lot of faculty go dormant, right? Or they'll just not look at their email very often, or they might be in the field, or they might, my dissertation director every year goes to a cabin at the furthest tip of Cape Cod that very intentionally does not have any internet. And so know that that's a good thing as you're thinking about timeline. Even though the deadlines are months away, maybe there's some things you should take care of now. So, well, let's pause there. I would hope to save about 10 minutes for any Q&A that we might have. So you're welcome to pop them in the chat or unmute yourself and ask any questions that you would have about how to get good letters of recommendation, how to manage that relationship. I guess we nailed it.
Hi, I had a quick question.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for the amazing presentation. That was really informational. I'm an online student, so I guess things look a little bit different in terms of like professor relationships, and I know you touched on that a little bit, but I was wondering what I could do specifically to, cultivate a stronger relationship without being able to, go in person and be able to just walk in the office. I know you mentioned office hours, but I wasn't sure if there's something else I could be doing as well.
Good question. Yeah, I think if there was something that happened in class that you're really genuinely curious about and you'd like to know more, you know, if you'd like to talk more about that, or if you'd like to find out more about the work that they're doing or the research that they're doing, those are good premises for doing office hours. Office hours tend to get clogged up when there's an exam or when people want to argue about the grade that they got on something, right? Not because like they want to have an actual conversation about course material. Another good premise is simply to ask life advice, to say, you know, I've been really enjoying this class, although I don't want to go into a career in psychology, you know, I'm thinking about this. I wonder if we could talk about, you know, the things I'm considering, you know, because they've worked with a lot of students, and you'll find most faculty members have actually had pretty interesting and varied lives. Most of them haven't always been professors, you know.
Okay, thank you.
I would also suggest that you attend some of the events that we have offered that are, you know, a lot of them are on Zoom, especially if it's something your professor promotes through the class. I'm always putting on our Canvas, you know, here's this great talk that's happening. And then you can go and talk to the professor like, oh, I went to this great talk that you recommended. Can we talk further about it? I'm really interested in it. Obviously, you don't have to do it for everything, but the things that you're interested in that connect to your academic field or your professional interests. But that's a really good way to show your professor that you're engaged in academic life and that you're using the opportunities that are available to you. And professors love to talk about it. They're like, oh my gosh, I went to that talk too. It was so amazing. Let's chat more about this this amazing person or this idea that they were spreading, or I read their book, and you know, here's some other things that they've written. So that's another good way to engage.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to amplify that one too. As an undergraduate, I didn't know it at the time, and you know, I didn't have anybody in my family that had gone to graduate school or anything like that. But I was an English major and an aspiring creative writer, and every time we hosted a writer or hosted a, you know, that you would see posters around. This was before Canvas, in the English department hallways and things like that. I'm like, oh, well, that looks great. I didn't know that that wasn't a thing undergraduates usually didn't do, and so the point was, if you're there and the faculty members see you there, or even if it's an online event and they see that you're there, they can see that engagement. Even better if you ask a question at the event or something like that. And I've read some really strong letters of recommendation where people talk about, yeah, the student, even though an undergraduate, really participates in departmental life, or I've talked to them or seen them at events, or I know they've participated in events. And that shows a different level of engagement than simply, you know, attending class and kind of tuning out for the rest of it. Your questions.
There's also a growing number of opportunities at ASU that are specifically offered online. So research opportunities for undergraduate students who are online, clubs and organizations for online students, events like has been mentioned, where there's speakers, panels, discussions that are online. And oftentimes professors are engaged in that in some form or fashion as well, whether that's they're supervising that research experience or advising that club or putting on that event or just being a participant in that event, right? So all of those things can be really value added just to your educational experience, but also ways to kind of build that rapport with those professors.
One additional point that just occurred to me is I've often given the advice that you should take professors, don't take classes. That may be a little quaint, and it might not be as feasible in the current environment that you know can even figure out who's teaching a class, much less take repeated classes from them. But I just kind of followed my nose as an undergraduate and say, wow, I really enjoyed that class. I'm going to take another, you know, it's like reading the next book in the series. Like I want to see what, you know, volume 2 is like. And I had 2 or 3 faculty members that I took 3 classes with, so when it came time to applying for graduate school, we had a lot of material to work with. And so, so finding that, if you can, you know, finding an opportunity to take more than one class with a professor actually really helps quite a bit. advice do you have? So Martina asked, what advice do you have for recommendation letters for students applying for online Bachelor of Science in Biology? So Martina, are you saying applying for graduate school, or are you applying for fellowships as a BS in biology? Okay, so you're thinking, yeah, I mean, assuming that if we're in the traditional sciences, that master's degree is probably going to require research, right? And so we would want to be sure that your letters of recommendation speak not only to your performance in the classroom, but also can speak to maybe your ability to do some research. So as Shay mentioned, there are increasing numbers, and I know SOLS has a whole page of research opportunities that people can get involved with, both fully digital and even some low residency ones. But some opportunity for someone to see you doing the kinds of things that you'd be doing as a graduate student. And even if it's a relatively short term, or, you know, apologies, my headphones just died. Can we hear me? Okay, good. Even if it's just short term or minimal, you know, that's incredibly useful. That's one thing you'd really want to think about, is like, what am I going to be expected to do in graduate school, and what can I do to show them that I know how to do that?
One small word of advice, which may or may not be relevant, but if you are applying to graduate school with anything that has a rolling admission, when you contact your professor to ask for a letter, do give them some idea of when the letter is due. Because I just had a student actually contact me not even 2 weeks ago, and they were actually expecting me to put the letter in like instantly. I didn't really know. I thought within soon means like 2 to 3 weeks, maybe. Apparently it was not. It was supposed to be in as soon as possible, but I had no idea. So in any case, just giving them sort of the definite deadline really, really helps. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, be a good partner. I think that's one of the takeaways here. So we're just about the end of our time. So I appreciate everyone who maybe hopefully sat there and snacked on lunch while we were going through this. I know I could grab some lunch. But yeah, this is one of the things I think we don't talk about enough, right? And I know faculty members do what they do because they want to help people. And most of the people that are in your life want to help you. And so if you can be a great partner with them, that's a win-win situation. So thank you to Dr. Bhattacharya and Dr. Stoff and Shay for joining us today, and all your wonderful input. And hopefully we will hear from you or see you around the office at some point. So thank you all very much.